The storm outside seemed to mock him. The wind, each gust fiercer than the last, battered against the walls of the cabin, as if trying to tear it down. Mike, breathing heavily with cold hands, could barely think. The silence that fell after he closed the door behind the bears was even more deafening. He was there, in the midst of chaos, frozen, his eyes fixed on the animals now huddled in their makeshift shelter, unsure if he was doing the right thing or if he had made an irreparable mistake. With every passing second, doubt crept deeper into his mind. What if he had made the wrong choice? Fear grew inside his chest, pressing down on him like an unbearable weight. What was he risking now? It wasn't just his survival, but his soul, his humanity. By opening that door, he had not only defied all the laws of nature but had also challenged everything he believed about himself, about what was right and wrong. What was happening inside him was a frantic battle, as if the very universe were collapsing on top of his head. He could feel the weight of his decision with every heartbeat. He knew there was no turning back. It wasn't about the bears or the storm anymore, it was something much larger, something he couldn't fully comprehend. He had touched the essence of life and death so intensely that he no longer knew who he was. But there was no time to reflect. The wind outside showed no mercy. Ice was starting to form on the cabin's walls, and the silence inside the shed was more terrifying than any noise from the storm. Mike looked at the bears, now trapped, trembling from the cold, and realized the danger wasn't over. They were here because of him, and he still had to worry about the worst part. Nature could react in ways he couldn't predict. Suddenly, the mother bear moved. With visible effort, she lifted her head and looked directly at Mike. But it wasn't the gaze of a panicked animal. No. Her eyes were filled with silent wisdom. There was trust there, but also a warning. A warning that somehow, he had broken the balance that should have been maintained. She knew what he had done. But what surprised him more was the strange feeling that ran down his spine. The mother bear was no longer just seeking shelter, she was testing him, challenging him. Mike felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. What was happening now? He knew his survival was increasingly tied to this choice. Yet, he couldn't pull away. Something was drawing him into this abyss of uncertainty, something he no longer knew how to control. What had he done? Each movement of the mother bear seemed more and more like a reflection of what Mike was feeling. The animal, nature, the entire universe, were somehow questioning him. And worse, he knew he had no answers. What he had thought was an act of compassion now seemed like sheer madness. What if he was tampering with something beyond his understanding? Something older, more dangerous. Nature does not forgive. Mike felt a weight so heavy in his chest that it seemed like he could no longer breathe. The door, still ajar, felt like a thin line between what he had done and what could come next. He could leave the bears behind, retreat back into his cabin, and leave it all behind. But he couldn't. Something kept him there, in that place and time, where he was being tested. But had he already lost control of everything? He knew that as the seconds passed, his humanity was being measured. What would he do next? Any wrong move now could mean the end, not just for the bears, but for himself as well. The fear and despair were so intense that Mike began to doubt everything. He looked at the cubs, struggling to move, still weak, and his body trembled. If he left now, they would die. But what if he stayed? What would happen when the storm passed and the true nature of all this was revealed? Deep down, Mike knew there was no turning back. He had crossed a line, and he didn't know if any human could return from something like this. Now, the silence was absolute. Everything was on hold. The wind outside seemed to be listening. Mike didn't know if he was ready for what would come next, but he knew that the next step he took would lead him to something irreversible. "Are you still there?" The question echoed in his mind, but the answer seemed beyond his understanding. What would he do now, faced with the impossible, with no more choices left? The storm outside was no longer just a force of nature. It was a monster, an untamable being whispering destruction in every gust of wind, in every snowflake slamming against the cabin. The sound of those gusts was not just noise. It was a scream. Screams that seemed to echo through Mike's soul, reverberating in his mind and heart. He stood there, motionless, immersed in a situation no man could have predicted. The fear he felt was tangible, heavy as a rock, crushing his insides with every passing second. The cabin, normally his refuge, now felt like a tomb. Every creak of the wood, every tremor in the ground made Mike feel like time was running out, as if the very universe was telling him he had done something irreversible. Nature would not forgive. He knew this. But the question that consumed him was no longer about the consequences of his action. It was about what he had become. He looked at the bears. The mother bear's gaze was fixed on him, but not with fear. Not with anger. It was a gaze of deep understanding, as if she knew exactly what he was feeling. As if she was silently asking him, "Do you have the courage to face what's coming next?" Mike felt a sudden wave of vertigo. The question he never wanted to ask, but that now haunted him: what if I don't survive this? The biting cold of the night invaded his skin, but it wasn't just the physical cold. It was the cold of his soul, that deep emptiness that comes when you know you've crossed all boundaries and there's no way to turn back. Each breath Mike took was a titanic effort, and each beat of his heart seemed more distant, more muffled. He felt as if he had lost himself somewhere between the man he was and the man he was becoming. What he had done could not be undone. The line had been broken. He was irreparably changed. The mother bear, with her cubs beside her, didn't move. She was in shock, but she was also waiting. Waiting for what, exactly? She knew that Mike, this human before her, could be the key to their survival, or the sentence of their ultimate death. What if he failed? What if he died there, unable to save anyone? Mike approached slowly, feeling his legs grow heavy, as if every movement was being pulled back by an invisible thread. He didn't know what to do next. He didn't know if he was acting out of compassion or pure madness. His mind was spinning. Fear had transformed into dread, a sensation that something much bigger than him was at stake. He moved cautiously, slowly, as if any sudden movement might break the fragile trust forming between him and the mother bear. The blankets he carried seemed almost insignificant in the face of the task ahead, but he knew it was the only thing he could offer. He covered the cubs, their bodies still cold and trembling, and the mother bear, with every remaining ounce of strength, didn't hesitate. She pulled them closer, not resisting the human touch, as if understanding the need for protection, even though it went against everything her nature told her to do. What Mike didn't know, what he couldn't foresee, was what would happen next. When he entered the shed with the bears, closed the door behind him, and stepped away, what he saw wasn't just an act of compassion, it was something much deeper. The silence that followed closing the door was unnerving. Mike stood there motionless, not knowing if he had done the right thing, if he had risked everything to save these animals. Fear overwhelmed him. But while the wind outside continued to break the bones of the night, something unexpected happened. The mother bear, though exhausted, moved without fear. She looked at him one last time, and her eyes were no longer empty, they were filled with silent understanding. It was no longer about fear, no longer about the fight for survival. It was something deeper, something Mike would only understand later. But he still didn't know what it meant. He stepped back, respecting her space. But his mind was in constant turmoil. What had he done? He had gone against all the rules. And now? What did this mean for him and the bears? What would happen next? It was a brutally cold February night deep in the heart of Alaska. The thermometer outside Mike Anderson's cabin read -40 degrees Celsius, but the biting wind made the air feel even more deadly. He knew a storm was coming, but nothing prepared him for what was about to unfold. Mike, an experienced wildlife photographer, had traded his hectic life in Seattle for a solitary refuge in the wild. His cabin was more than 4 hours away from the nearest town, and the frigid winds of winter threatened to tear through his last barrier against nature's chaos. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, he spent his days preparing for the unpredictable, knowing that one mistake in the wilderness could be fatal. But tonight, things were different. The weather forecast warned of an unprecedented storm. A low-pressure system from the north promised winds so powerful they could uproot trees, and relentless snow was falling, blanketing everything in a silent shroud of death. Mike wasn't a stranger to such challenges. He had spent the last 5 years adapting to life in the wild, but tonight, the situation was about to test his limits. As the wind howled against the cabin, Mike prepared a simple meal, soup and bread. Everything he had was precious, and the storm could last for days. But before he could settle, something strange cut through the howling wind, a low guttural sound coming from outside, almost imperceptible amidst the roar of the storm. His heart raced. He rushed to the window, grabbed his lantern, and looked outside. His breath fogged up the glass, but through the swirling snow, he saw movement in the shadows. In the midst of this white hell, 3 dark figures were crawling through the snow. Mike adjusted his focus, and his eyes widened. It was a mother bear with her 2 cubs. They were struggling against the forces of nature, as if winter itself had set out to destroy them. What Mike saw wasn't a natural spectacle, it was a fight for survival. The mother bear, normally a mighty creature, was weak, her movements slow and unsteady. Her cubs, covered in snow, could barely move. The struggle was palpable. Mike felt a cold premonition deep in his bones. Their den had been destroyed, and now they were desperately searching for shelter. But what was he supposed to do? Survival rules were clear: never approach a wild animal, especially a bear in distress. But the image of the mother bear, her eyes tired and filled with fear, drove him forward. He knew she was on the brink of collapse. If he didn't do something, they would all perish in the cold. The rules said to stay away, but what Mike was witnessing transcended that. He watched the mother bear struggle with all her strength to protect her cubs, and doubt overwhelmed him. Nature was merciless, but what had he learned about courage and compassion? The decision he faced wasn't just about survival, it was about his humanity. What was more dangerous, disobeying the rules and acting, or letting them die right in front of him? With the wind still howling, Mike pulled away from the window, his mind racing. He moved to his small storage shed, a separate structure he used to store his photography gear and provisions. The cabin shook under the pressure of the wind, but urgency drove him forward. He knew if he didn't act, he would lose more than a chance to save these animals. He would lose a part of himself. He prepared the shed, turning on the heaters and laying out heavy blankets. He prepared food, being careful with every movement, knowing that one mistake could be fatal. His breath was heavy, his muscles tense. The success of his plan depended on speed, getting the bears inside before the cold consumed them. He looked out the window one more time. The mother bear, exhausted, was trying to move one of her cubs, their bodies trembling from the cold. Hours passed like eternity, and Mike knew time was running out. He steeled himself, and with one last look, opened the cabin door. The wind sliced through him like sharp knives, but he didn't hesitate. He knew this was now or never. As he approached, the mother bear lifted her eyes to meet his. Their gazes locked, and Mike felt something profound. It wasn't fear but silent acceptance, as if she knew he was her last hope. He moved cautiously, covering the cubs with blankets, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on him. He knew in that moment, his life and theirs were now intertwined. What would happen next? He didn't know. But Mike felt something few ever would. Nature, in its cruelty and beauty, was demanding a choice from him. And though he knew the storm wouldn't pass quickly, the night had only just begun, and the battle for survival, for both him and the bears, was far from over. The storm raged with increasing fury, and the wind seemed to tear at Mike's very bones. Every gust made the cabin shake as if the world itself was crumbling around him. He knew that outside, the bears were on the brink of collapse. The mother bear was trying to protect her cubs, but the struggle was evident. The exhaustion was clear in her eyes, and the relentless snow continued to fall. Mike watched, paralyzed, as they struggled forward, each step feeling like an eternity. His survival instinct screamed at him to pull back, to protect himself, to not get involved. The survival rules he had followed all these years were clear: never interfere with nature. But in that moment, everything he saw defied those rules. This was no longer about nature's cruelty, it was life or death, not just for the bears, but for him too. If he did nothing, what would become of him? The dilemma consumed him. He knew what the rules said, but now, he couldn't look out the window without feeling the crushing weight of an impossible decision. The images of the struggle, the empty gaze of the mother bear, her fragile effort to protect her cubs, were burned into his mind like an incessant echo. He couldn't simply ignore it. He knew that if he did, something inside him would break forever. There was no time left to wait. He grabbed the lantern, his body trembling from the cold cutting through the open door. His hands felt heavy, as though every movement was the hardest of his life. What he was about to do wasn't just about survival, it was a breaking of everything he believed about nature, about his own limits. Every step toward the door was a step into the unknown. Each movement, heavier than the last. Doubt gnawed at his mind, but urgency was even stronger. When he opened the door, the freezing wind hit him so hard that his lungs almost stopped. He almost pulled back, but then through the snow curtain, he saw the bears desperate, struggling to survive. The mother bear, weak, was almost out of strength. But in her eyes, something sparked, a flicker of trust, as if she knew that this human was her last hope. And in that silent look, Mike knew there was no turning back. He had to act. The storm outside was no longer just a force of nature. It was a monster, an untamable being whispering destruction in every gust of wind, in every snowflake slamming against the cabin. The sound of those gusts was not just noise. It was a scream. Screams that seemed to echo through Mike's soul, reverberating in his mind and heart. He stood there, motionless, immersed in a situation no man could have predicted. The fear he felt was tangible, heavy as a rock, crushing his insides with every passing second. The cabin, normally his refuge, now felt like a tomb. Every creak of the wood, every tremor in the ground made Mike feel like time was running out, as if the very universe was telling him he had done something irreversible. Nature would not forgive. He knew this. But the question that consumed him was no longer about the consequences of his action. It was about what he had become. He looked at the bears. The mother bear's gaze was fixed on him, but not with fear, not with anger. It was a gaze of deep understanding, as if she knew exactly what he was feeling. As if she was silently asking him, "Do you have the courage to face what's coming next?" Mike felt a sudden wave of vertigo. The question he never wanted to ask, but that now haunted him: what if I don't survive this? The biting cold of the night invaded his skin, but it wasn't just the physical cold. It was the cold of his soul, that deep emptiness that comes when you know you've crossed all boundaries and there's no way to turn back. Each breath Mike took was a titanic effort, and each beat of his heart seemed more distant, more muffled. He felt as if he had lost himself somewhere between the man he was and the man he was becoming. What he had done could not be undone. The line had been broken. He was irreparably changed. The mother bear, with her cubs beside her, didn't move. She was in shock, but she was also waiting. Waiting for what, exactly? She knew that Mike, this human before her, could be the key to their survival, or the sentence of their ultimate death. What if he failed? What if he died there, unable to save anyone? Mike approached slowly, feeling his legs grow heavy, as if every movement was being pulled back by an invisible thread. He didn't know what to do next. He didn't know if he was acting out of compassion or pure madness. His mind was spinning. Fear had transformed into dread, a sensation that something much bigger than him was at stake. He looked one last time at the cubs. The little bears were nearly motionless, their bodies freezing with every passing second. Mike could see how the snow covered their fur, how the cold consumed them. They were on the edge of death, but there was still a chance, a small chance, that he could save at least one of them. But the real question wasn't about the bears. The real question, which now hammered in Mike's head like a metal drum, was, would he survive this? Would he be able to bear the weight of this decision? He felt an immense pain in his chest, as if his body was being crushed from the inside out. The cold, the fear, the tension. He no longer knew if he was there to save the bears or to save himself. And the most agonizing part, he didn't know if he could live with the decision he made. Every second seemed to stretch, as if time was expanding forever, leaving Mike trapped in a limbo of despair and uncertainty. What would he do now? It was too late to turn back, and he knew it. If he wasn't brave enough, everything could end in tragedy. If he made a mistake, it wouldn't just be an error. It would be the end of everything he believed in, everything he was. And he knew nature wouldn't show mercy. Mike was no longer alone. He wasn't just facing the bears or the storm anymore. He was facing something profoundly human, something he never imagined would be put to the test this way. What was he willing to sacrifice to do the right thing? The wind, still furious, seemed to whisper his name. Mike. It was nature speaking to him, or maybe it was his own fear, the fear of failure. What would he do? He could feel the weight of each decision, as if everyone's future was hanging by a thread. The tension was unbearable. The world was frozen in a single moment of anticipation, and Mike knew that if he didn't make a decision, time would run out, the storm would take everything. The only thing left to do was decide. But how could he decide? What would he do now?